Alan Szokert stood by the large window of the research station called Manaski and watched the stars float in the endless black space around him. He worked as a language expert on this station that hung between human territory and the space controlled by an alien race called the Zelthians. His job was usually boring because most days he just reviewed old documents about how humans should talk to aliens if they ever met new ones. But today was different because something impossible had appeared on his computer screen. The station's sensors had found two objects drifting through empty space far from any planet or ship. At first, Alan thought they might be pieces of space junk or maybe broken parts from some old satellite, but when the computer finished analyzing them, he could not believe what he was reading. The translation system in the station identified both objects as dictionaries from Earth. Not digital files or data storage devices, but actual physical books made of paper with printed words inside them. This made no sense at all because the station was 300 light-years away from Earth and paper books could not survive in space for very long. Karen Phillips walked into the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and nearly dropped both of them when she saw what was on Alan's screen. She was another scientist on the station who studied communication patterns, and she had worked with Alan for almost 2 years now. She put the coffee down carefully and leaned over his shoulder to look at the data more closely. The computer showed that these dictionaries had been floating in space for about 47 years based on the tiny marks and damage on their surfaces from dust particles hitting them over time. The path they had traveled came from a region of space that humans called the Quiet Expanse, because no one had explored it until very recently. This area was known for being completely empty, with no stars or planets or anything interesting in it at all. Alan pulled up more information and felt his heart start beating faster when he saw which dictionaries these were. One was called the Collins English Dictionary Revised Edition, and the other was the Merriam-Webster Comprehensive Dictionary. Both books had been printed in the year 2089, back on Earth. But what made this really strange was that both of these exact dictionary types had been standard equipment on a colony ship called the Endeavour. Everyone in human space knew about the Endeavour because it was one of the greatest mysteries in their history. The ship had left Earth in 2090, carrying 10,000 people who wanted to start a new life on a planet in the Andromeda sector. The journey should have taken about 30 years, but the ship never arrived at its destination. In 2091, all contact with the Endeavour was lost, and despite many search missions over the following decades, no one ever found any trace of the ship or its passengers. Most people assumed the ship had been destroyed in some kind of accident, but no one knew for sure. Karen looked at Alan with wide eyes and asked if he really thought these dictionaries came from the lost colony ship. Alan said he did not know, but they needed to bring the objects to the station right away so they could examine them properly. Within 6 hours, a small recovery drone had collected both dictionaries and brought them back to Manaski. The books were sealed inside protective containers, so they would not be damaged by the station's air or temperature. The station commander was a woman named Patricia Hayes, who had been in charge of Manaski for 5 years. She called an emergency meeting as soon as she heard about the discovery. Alan and Karen sat in the conference room along with Lieutenant Greg Morrison, who was the military representative on the station, and a doctor named Henry Cole, who studied alien biology and strange objects found in space. Patricia asked Alan to explain everything again from the beginning so she could understand exactly what they had found. Alan brought up a holographic display that showed the dictionaries and their trajectory through space. He explained that based on the evidence, these books had almost certainly come from the Endeavour and had been drifting for nearly 50 years. The question was why anyone would send dictionaries floating through space and how they had survived for so long without being destroyed. Greg leaned forward in his chair and asked if there might be a message hidden inside the books. Henry said he had already scanned them with every instrument available on the station, and there was definitely something unusual about them. The dictionaries were giving off a very faint electromagnetic signal, which was not natural for paper books. This meant someone had put some kind of electronic device inside them. The team decided to open the first dictionary, which was the Merriam-Webster volume. They did this very carefully inside a sealed laboratory, where the air and temperature could be controlled perfectly. When they opened the book to check inside, they found something between pages 847 and 848. It was a thin metal chip about the size of a fingernail tucked right at the entry, for the word survival. Alan's hands shook a little bit as he carefully removed the chip and placed it into an isolated computer system that was not connected to the station's main network. This was a safety precaution in case the chip contained a virus or some other dangerous program. The screen flickered for a moment and then text started appearing line by line. The message began by saying that if anyone was reading this, then their message had survived the long journey through space. It said that the crew and passengers of the Endeavour were alive, but they were not where they had intended to go. Something had pulled them off course and taken them to a different place. The message said that everything humanity thought it knew about faster-than-light travel was completely wrong. The text was damaged in many places with whole sentences missing or corrupted by radiation exposure over the decades, but what they could read was disturbing and confusing. The message talked about something called the architects who had diverted the Endeavour from its planned route. The writers of the message seemed frightened but also amazed by what they had discovered. Patricia immediately ordered that the second dictionary should be opened as well. The Collins dictionary also contained a metal chip, but this one was larger and seemed to be in better condition. When they accessed this chip, it displayed a star map showing a region of space that was not on any human charts. At the center of the map, someone had written a note that said they were waiting at this location and that humans had never been the ones to make first contact. Someone else had been waiting for humanity all along. Alan stared at the dictionaries sitting in their protective cases and felt like his entire understanding of the universe had just been turned upside down. These simple books that looked so ordinary and human had traveled across hundreds of light years to deliver a warning. But a warning about what exactly and why had the people of the Endeavour chosen to hide their message inside dictionaries instead of just sending a normal radio signal or data file? 3 days passed since the discovery, and Station Manaski had become the most important place in all of human-controlled space. Alan Szokert barely slept during this time, because he spent every moment trying to piece together the damaged messages from the chips hidden inside the dictionaries. Karen Phillips worked next to him at their station, which was now surrounded by security fields and armed guards, who made sure no one unauthorized could enter the area. The data on the chips was falling apart faster than anyone had expected. Every time they tried to read a file, more of the information would corrupt and disappear forever. It seemed like the files had been designed to decay on purpose, so that only the most important messages would survive long enough to be read. This made Alan work even faster because he knew they might lose critical information if they did not hurry. Karen suddenly called Alan over to her screen and showed him a text file she had managed to reconstruct. It was written by a man named Paul Brennan, who had been the chief engineer on the Endeavour. In this log entry, Paul described what happened 3 weeks after the ship left Earth orbit. The Endeavour had been pulled out of normal space into what he called a place between places. At first, the crew thought their experimental, faster-than-light drive had malfunctioned, but then something very strange started happening to everyone on board. The crew members began to understand things they had not known just moments before. Mathematical concepts that would normally take years to learn suddenly made perfect sense to them. Universal constants and laws of physics became as easy to understand as breathing. Then slowly the crew started to perceive something else in this strange place with them. They called these beings the architects. Alan read another file out loud so Karen could hear it too. The file explained that the architects were not a normal species like humans or any other aliens. They were some kind of collective consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions at the same time. They had been watching intelligent species throughout the galaxy for millions of years, and they had one main purpose. The architects wanted to decide which species were ready to learn the truth about how the universe really worked. Lieutenant Greg Morrison came into the lab looking very serious and told them that Fleet Command wanted a full briefing in 2 hours. He said that Admiral Frank Bishop was coming to the station personally, which meant the military was taking this situation very seriously. Alan nodded but kept his attention focused on another file he had just recovered. This file had been written by the head linguist on the Endeavour, whose name was Dr. Linda Martinez. She had studied communication theory and first contact protocols just like Alan did. Her notes were both fascinating and terrifying. She described how the architects communicated through something she called conceptual injection. They did not use words or language the way humans did. Instead, they pushed understanding directly into the minds of people they contacted. Dr. Martinez wrote, that the big problem was that human brains were not designed to receive information this way. Some people on the Endeavor adapted to it better than others, but many went insane from the experience. Everyone who had contact with the architects changed in ways they could not predict or control. Karen managed to recover a video file that was partially damaged, but still watchable. The video showed the interior of the Endeavor, but something looked wrong. The crew members in the footage moved in odd ways, and their faces had distant expressions like they were looking at something far away. One man stood completely still for the entire 30-second clip with his eyes open, but not seeing anything around him. Henry Cole rushed into the lab and told them they needed to come see something right away. He led Alan and Karen to the medical analysis room where the physical dictionaries were being examined, under different types of light and scanning equipment. On the main display screen was an image that seemed impossible. When the dictionaries were viewed under a special combination of ultraviolet and infrared light, new text appeared on every single page. This was not printed text, but something that had been embedded into the molecular structure of the paper itself. Someone had hidden a message in the physical material of the books. Henry explained that this hidden text was actually a massive warning that covered thousands of pages. Every page of both dictionaries had been converted into storage space for information. Every margin and every blank space contained hidden data. It would take weeks to read everything that had been stored this way. Alan felt his legs get weak and he had to sit down. He asked how long it would take to translate all of this hidden text. Henry said at their current pace it would take at least 3 weeks, but there was something Alan needed to see right away. The very first page of hidden text contained a message addressed specifically to whoever found these books. Alan read the message out loud, and his voice shook as he spoke the words. The message said it came from 147 survivors of the Endeavor, out of the original 10,000 people who had been on the ship. Most of the passengers were gone, but not dead. They had been transformed into something that could no longer be called human. The survivors had chosen to resist what the architects offered because they realized something important. The price of the architects' knowledge was losing everything that made a person human. The message warned that the architects would eventually offer humanity the same gift. They would show people wonders beyond imagination and make them understand the fundamental nature of reality, but accepting that understanding meant that humanity would stop existing in the way it currently did. The survivors explained that the dictionaries were more than just a warning. They were also a test that the survivors had designed. The architects could not understand why humans valued words and created symbols for concepts, instead of just knowing things directly. The architects believed that language was a primitive limitation that held intelligent beings back. But the survivors believed that language was humanity's greatest strength. It was a barrier that kept human minds individual and separate. It was a filter that let people process the universe at a human pace in human terms. The message urged whoever found the dictionaries to prepare humanity for what was coming. The architects were patient, but they would reach out again eventually. When Admiral Frank Bishop arrived at the station, he was earlier than expected. He was a large man with gray hair and eyes that looked tired from seeing too many difficult things. He told Alan and the team to show him everything they had discovered. For 6 hours, Alan and his colleagues presented all their findings to the Admiral. He listened without speaking, and his face showed no emotion at all. When they finished, he stood up and walked to the observation window to look out at the stars beyond the station. The Admiral asked where the Endeavor survivors were now. Commander Patricia Hayes said they did not know the exact location, but the star map from the dictionaries showed a region that had never been explored. It would take a full expedition with ships and crew to reach that area of space. The Admiral said they would send an expedition, but first they needed to understand the warning better. He looked directly at Alan and said that as humanity's expert on first contact and linguistics, he needed to answer one critical question. If the architects made contact with Earth or any human colony, could humans resist their influence? Alan thought about everything he had read over the past 3 days. He thought about the crew members who had been transformed and the ones who had chosen to stay human, despite how hard it was. He thought about language and the power of words to shape how people think. He thought about humanity's stubborn habit of defining reality in their own terms instead of accepting what others told them. Alan told the Admiral that yes, humans could resist, but only if they prepared properly. Humanity needed to understand that language was not just a tool for talking. It was a shield for the mind. The Endeavour survivors had learned this the hard way, and now they were giving humanity a head start. Admiral Bishop said they had a lot of work to do, and he was declaring this a priority alpha situation. Every linguist and cognitive scientist and philosopher in human space would be brought into this project. They were going to teach humanity how to think in words and hold on to language even when offered something that seemed easier and better. The Admiral looked at the dictionaries in their protective cases one more time before leaving. He said quietly that they would find the Endeavour survivors and bring them home because they had earned that much after everything they had been through. 6 weeks after finding the dictionaries, Alan Szokert was working in a secret facility on Earth that he had not even known existed before Admiral Bishop brought him there. The place was called the Bastion, and it was where humanity prepared for threats that could destroy their entire civilization. The project had grown much bigger than Alan ever imagined it would. Every major university and military research group and scientific institution across human space had been quietly recruited to help. The official story that most people heard was that they were developing better ways to communicate with aliens during first contact. Only a small group of people knew the real truth, which was that humanity was preparing to meet a species that could literally rewrite human consciousness and turn people into something completely different. Karen Phillips had become his partner in leading what was officially called the Linguistic Shield Initiative. Their team now included hundreds of specialists who studied how the brain worked and how people thought and how language shaped human understanding. The Admiral believed that if language was humanity's defense, then they needed experts in every aspect of how humans created and processed and lived through words. Karen came into Alan's office and dropped a data tablet on his desk. She said the latest translations had arrived from Manaski, where people were still working on decoding the hidden text from the dictionaries. Alan needed to read section 512 right away. Alan pulled up the indicated section on his screen. It was a personal account, written by one of the Endeavour survivors named George Webb, who had been a schoolteacher before joining the colony mission. His story was different from the technical reports that Alan had been reading because it focused on the human cost of what happened. George wrote about a woman he had known on the ship named Claire, who had worked as a botanist before the architects made contact. Claire loved making terrible puns, and she had 3 children who she cared about more than anything. But after she accepted what the architects offered, she stopped speaking entirely. Not because she could not speak, but because she no longer needed to use words at all. Within 1 week, Claire had forgotten her children's names. Not because she stopped loving them, but because the concept of names became meaningless when she could simply know who someone was, without needing a label to identify them. George wrote that Claire was still alive as far as he knew, but the person he had known was completely gone. She existed in a state of perfect understanding, but it had made her less than what she used to be. Alan shared this passage with Dr. Helen Price, who was the project's lead expert on how the brain and nervous system worked. She read it with a worried expression on her face. Helen said this matched what they were discovering in their computer simulations. They had been creating models of what happened to brain pathways when language processing was bypassed. The results were very disturbing. Language was not just how people communicated with each other. It was how they maintained individual identity and remained separate, distinct persons. Without language, human consciousness became fluid and interconnected, but people stopped being discrete individuals. Alan asked if she was saying humans would merge together. Helen said yes, in a way. The architects existed as a collective consciousness where all minds were connected. Their gift of direct understanding would pull human minds toward that same state. Humanity would become one big collective, which sounded wonderful, until you realized it meant the death of individuality. Lieutenant Greg Morrison joined their meeting, and he looked exhausted from working too many hours. He had been coordinating with military branches across all of human space to prepare for what they called an uplift scenario. This was when a more advanced species tried to forcibly advance a younger species whether they wanted it or not. Greg reported that the fleet was ready with new communication protocols that relied heavily on verbal confirmation and passwords, based on language. If the architects made contact, they could at least make sure the military command structure did not immediately collapse. But Karen pointed out that this was the easy part because military discipline was built on following orders given in words. The real problem was what would happen to civilian populations. How could they convince a farmer on some colony world that he should keep using words and struggling to learn things when he could simply accept the gift and instantly know how to grow crops perfectly? Why would anyone choose the hard path when an easy path was available? Admiral Bishop had insisted on one particular experiment. A group of volunteers who were linguists and soldiers were currently in isolation, being trained in something called linguistic defense. The idea was to root their thinking so deeply in language-based processing that even if the architects tried to push concepts directly into their minds, those concepts would be automatically filtered through language first. Alan visited the training facility and found it strange. The volunteers spent hours doing what looked like meditation, but instead of clearing their minds, they filled them with words. They read poetry and technical manuals and anything else that would create a constant stream of language in their thoughts. One volunteer named Kyle Porter tried to explain it to Alan. Kyle said it was like learning to never stop talking to yourself inside your head. Every sensation and every thought had to be immediately translated into words. If he saw the color blue, he did not just perceive it. He thought the words that is blue spelled BLUE, the color of clear sky, the wavelength between green and violet. Kyle admitted it was exhausting, but it seemed to work. When they ran simulations and tried to push concepts directly into the volunteers' minds, those concepts automatically got converted to language first. This slowed down the understanding and made it manageable and kept the person in control of their own thoughts. Meanwhile, Henry Cole had been studying the physical dictionaries, trying to understand how the Endeavour survivors had embedded so much information at the molecular level. What he discovered changed everything about how they understood the situation. Henry announced at the weekly briefing that the survivors had not done this alone. The molecular embedding required technology far beyond what the Endeavour had available. The architects had actually helped them create the dictionaries. Everyone started asking questions at once, but Henry raised his hand for silence. He explained that the architects had helped because the survivors convinced them this was a valid scientific experiment. The architects were not evil or malicious. They genuinely believed they were helping species evolve to a higher state, but they were also scientists who valued knowledge and testing theories. When the Endeavour survivors argued that language-based consciousness might have value, the architects became intrigued. They wanted to see if it was true. Commander Patricia Hayes, who had also been brought to Earth for the project, asked if this whole thing was just a test. Henry said yes, and the architects were watching to see if humanity would choose language over direct understanding. Alan felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were not just preparing for first contact. They were preparing to demonstrate that humanity's way of thinking had real inherent value that should not be discarded. Admiral Bishop looked directly at Alan and said the exploration vessel Unity was finished and equipped with everything they had learned. The ship needed linguists and soldiers trained in linguistic defense and scholars who could talk with the architects. It also had weapons powerful enough to escape if diplomacy failed. The Admiral said the ship needed someone who understood both the technical and philosophical aspects of this situation, someone who had studied the Endeavour survivors' writings for weeks, someone who could speak for all of humanity. Alan realized what the Admiral was asking. The Admiral wanted him to lead the contact team on the Unity. Karen would stay on Earth and continue decoding the dictionaries, but Alan would go out into space, following the star map to wherever the Endeavour survivors were waiting. That night, Alan stood alone, in his quarters looking at a printed copy of the first page of the Merriam-Webster dictionary. The entry for the word aardvark was circled with a note, written in the margin that said begin at the beginning and remember where words come from. Alan thought about how every dictionary started with aardvark or some other arbitrary word. Language was something humans had built over thousands of years. It was imperfect and sometimes absurd, but it belonged to humanity. The architects offered perfect understanding, but in that perfection would humans lose the messy, beautiful process of learning and growing and becoming? Alan accepted the assignment. The Unity would launch in 3 weeks, carrying not just a crew but humanity's hope that their limitations were actually their greatest strength. The question was no longer about where the dictionaries had been floating, but where they would lead and what humanity would find when they reached the end of the journey. The Unity left Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning, though time would soon stop meaning much when they were traveling through deep space. Alan Szokert stood on the bridge watching his homeworld get smaller and smaller until it was just a blue dot, and then it disappeared completely from view. The ship's captain was a woman named Laura Nichols who had commanded deep space exploration vessels for 20 years. She had been told everything about the mission, and she personally selected every crew member based on their mental stability and their skill with language. Laura announced that all systems were working normally and told the engineering section to prepare for the first jump into faster-than-light travel. The Unity had the latest FTL drive, which was an improved version of the technology that had caused problems for the Endeavour decades ago. The difference was that this time humanity was prepared, and this time they actually wanted to be noticed by the architects. The linguistics team on the Unity consisted of Alan and 3 other people. There was Dr. Sophie Lewis, who specialized in nonverbal communication. There was Jack Turner, who was a philosopher studying consciousness and how minds worked. And there was Maria Santos, who was a therapist trained to help crew members maintain their language-based thought patterns if they came under stress. The military section was led by Commander Nick Hudson, who was a Special Forces officer. He had undergone all the intensive linguistic defense training until thinking in words became as natural as breathing. His squad of 20 soldiers had practiced the same techniques until they could do it automatically without thinking about it. The navigation officer counted down from 3 to 1 and then activated the FTL drive. Reality twisted in a way that was hard to describe. For a moment that felt like forever. Alan existed in a space that was not really space. He felt his mind reaching for understanding beyond words, but his training kicked in automatically. He forced himself to describe what he was feeling and to narrate the experience using language in his thoughts. Then they came through the jump and emerged in a star system that was not listed on any human charts. The map from the Endeavour had been accurate and had led them to the right place. The science officer reported that sensors were detecting multiple planets orbiting the star. The third planet from the star showed artificial structures that were massive in scale. The officer also said that something was scanning their ship right now. Laura looked at Alan because this was his responsibility now. Alan told them to open communication channels on all frequencies using every method available. They sent text and audio and video and mathematical sequences to let whoever was out there know that humans had come to talk. For 5 hours they broadcast their messages and waited for a response. Alan used this time to review the final sections of dictionary translations that Karen had sent before the Unity departed. The Endeavour survivors had left very specific instructions for this moment. Dr. Linda Martinez had written that they should not try to speak the architects' language because the architects did not have language in any way humans could understand. Instead, humans should demonstrate their own language. The survivors said to argue with each other and tell jokes and read poetry out loud. This would make the architects curious about why humans chose such an inefficient but beautiful way of thinking. When the response finally came, it was not what anyone expected. Text appeared on every screen in the ship at the same time, and it was written in perfect English. The message said, "We remember you and the ones who remained small," and told them to come to the third planet, where others like them were waiting. The Unity approached the planet very carefully. It was a living world with green vegetation and blue oceans, but it was covered with structures that looked wrong somehow. The structures seemed to shift and change when people looked at them as if they existed in more dimensions than human eyes could perceive. A shuttle was prepared to go down to the surface. Alan and Commander Nick and Sophie and Jack would make the initial contact. Maria would stay on the Unity to monitor their mental states from orbit using special equipment. As the shuttle descended through the atmosphere, Sophie pointed out the window at something on the ground. Near the largest of the shifting alien structures, there were buildings that looked human. They were simple and functional and almost primitive compared to the alien architecture around them. Alan said it must be the Endeavour settlement. They landed in a clearing between the human buildings and the alien structures. This was a deliberate choice to be in the space between 2 different types of existence. People came out of the human buildings. They were older and their faces showed the effects of living on an alien world for many years, but their eyes were clear and focused. They had human eyes. An older man stepped forward and Alan recognized him immediately from the writings. It was Paul Brennan, who had been the chief engineer of the Endeavour. Paul said they had come and his voice carried decades of hope and fear mixed together. Alan said they understood the warning and they were here to learn more. Alan asked where the others were, meaning the people who had accepted the architect's gift. Paul pointed toward the alien structures and said they were there in a way. Those people existed in a state of collective understanding now. They were still alive and still conscious, but they were not individual humans anymore. Paul said they seemed content and maybe even happy, but they were definitely not human in any meaningful sense. Behind the contact team, something began to appear. It was not really appearing, but rather coming into a form that human senses could perceive as if it had always been there. But only now were they capable of noticing it. This was an architect. It did not have a fixed shape and appeared differently to each person who looked at it. To Alan, it looked like lights arranged in patterns that suggested meaning. To Sophie, it seemed like a sculpture made of concepts. To Jack, it looked like a mathematical equation that breathed and moved. But they all heard it the same way. Understanding pushed directly into their minds, bypassing language completely. The architect said welcome, and that it had waited with interest to see if others would come. Alan forced himself to translate the understanding into words before he responded. He spoke out loud deliberately, using his voice to form the words. He introduced himself as Alan Szokert, and said he spoke for humanity, which was a species that valued words over direct knowing. He said they had come to understand what happened to the Endeavor, and to determine if humans and architects could coexist without one consuming the other. The architect shifted its form in what might have been curiosity. It said that humans clung to their limitations, and this was fascinating. Most species embraced the gift of understanding eagerly, but humans resisted even knowing what they could gain. Alan replied that they resisted because they knew what they would lose. He gestured toward Paul and the other survivors and said, these people had shown humanity the cost. He said that understanding without the journey of learning was like seeing a mountain peak without climbing it. The destination might be the same, but the experience and the struggle and the growth had value. The architect said that humans spoke of inefficiency as if it were a virtue. Alan said no, they spoke of inefficiency as identity. Humans were the sum of their struggles to understand things. Take away the struggle and you took away what made them human. Sophie stepped forward and added her voice to the conversation. She asked if the architects had studied many species, and whether any others had chosen to remain in their limited state. The architect seemed to think about this question for a long time. Finally, it said that in all their observations, 3 species had refused the gift entirely, and those 3 species no longer existed. They had been unable to compete with their uplifted neighbors and had fallen behind and faded away. Humans were the 4th species to express interest in maintaining linguistic consciousness. Jack said that humans were not refusing the gift entirely, though. They were asking for something different, which was coexistence. Could the architects help humans develop defenses that would allow interaction without absorption? Could the architects understand that diversity of consciousness had value in itself? For a long moment, the architect did not respond. Then slowly it began to shift through different shapes until it settled on something that resembled a human figure, though it was still ethereal and incomplete. The architect said this was an experiment then. Humans were proposing that language-based consciousness could persist in a universe of direct understanding, that individual minds could remain separate while still participating in the greater conversation. Alan said yes, that was exactly what they were proposing. The survivors had proved it was possible because they had maintained their humanity for 47 years, while living next to those who had transcended. They had built a bridge between 2 types of existence. The architect said it would agree to this experiment, but humans must understand one thing. If linguistic consciousness proved unsustainable, then the architects would offer the gift again, because they believed all minds should be free of what they saw as the prison of language. Alan replied firmly that language was not a prison but a garden that humanity had cultivated for thousands of years, growing it, word by word, and tending it with care. Humans would not let it be destroyed for the promise of an easier path. 3 months after returning from the architect world, Alan Szokert found himself at the center of humanity's greatest debate. The Bastion had become extremely busy, though most of the public still did not know the true nature of the crisis they faced. The official story that regular people heard was that humans had made contact with a new alien species. The reality was that humanity was deciding its own future and whether it wanted to remain human or become something else entirely. Karen Phillips had taken over all public communication, while Alan worked with the Endeavor survivors to establish training centers across human space. They called these places language preservation institutes, and their purpose was simple, which was to teach people how to protect their minds from being rewritten. The first architect. Appearance at a human colony happened sooner than anyone expected. A world called New Seattle, with 2 million people living on it, reported that an entity matching the architect description had appeared in the capital city square. The architect offered its gift to anyone who wanted it, and 5,000 people accepted immediately. Alan watched video footage of what happened and felt sick to his stomach. The acceptance was fast, and people simply stopped speaking as their eyes took on a distant quality. Within just a few hours, they had formed a collective consciousness that merged together and existed separately from the rest of the colony population. Governor Lisa Campbell of New Seattle contacted Alan directly, and her face showed barely controlled panic. She reported that the transcended ones were not hostile at all. In fact, they were more efficient than before and could solve problems instantly while working in perfect coordination. But they were not people anymore. They were something completely different. Alan asked if the transcended ones had tried to convince others to join them. Lisa said yes constantly, but not through words, because they were past using language. Anyone who spent time near them started to feel a pull toward transcendence. The transcended ones radiated contentment and perfect understanding. Several hundred more people had already requested to be uplifted. The situation was spreading quickly. Within 2 weeks, 17 different human worlds reported architect appearances. The pattern was always the same, with the architect offering its gift and some people accepting, and then slowly more and more people converting to the transcended state. Admiral Bishop called an emergency session of the Human Council, which was the governing body that represented all human colonies and worlds. Alan was called to testify along with Paul Brennan and several cognitive scientists who had been studying what transcendence did to people. The council chamber was extremely tense. Representatives from colonies where transcendence was happening demanded action. Representatives from worlds that had not been affected yet demanded isolation protocols. Everyone wanted answers, but no one agreed on solutions. Alan stood at the central podium and spoke clearly to the assembled representatives. He said the architects were not attacking humanity. They were offering a choice, and some humans were choosing transcendence, which was their right as free individuals. The job of the government was not to prevent that choice, but to ensure that people who wanted to remain human had the knowledge and tools to do so. A representative from Proxima Colony named Vincent Shaw stood up angrily. He said his daughter had accepted the gift 3 days ago, and now she was gone. She existed somewhere in the collective, but she was not his daughter anymore. He demanded to know if Alan was saying he should have just accepted this. Alan replied firmly that he was saying the daughter should have been prepared better. The Language Preservation Institutes were teaching people how to maintain their individuality, but humanity had only had 3 months to set this up. They needed years to prepare properly. Paul Brennan stepped forward to join Alan at the podium. He said he had lived through this experience and watched friends and family transcend. Fighting it with force did not work at all. The only defense was a strong sense of self that was rooted in language and individual thought. Humans could teach this and were teaching it, but it took time. The debate went on for hours, with representatives arguing back and forth. In the end, the council passed a resolution that tried to balance both sides. There would be no interference with people who chose transcendence, but there would be mandatory education in linguistic defense for all citizens of human space. The training programs were rolled out everywhere. Children learned poetry and wordplay in school. Adults practiced internal narration, where they described everything they experienced in words. Everyone was taught to think in complete sentences and to translate raw perception into language before processing it. The training worked to some degree. The rate of voluntary transcendence slowed down significantly. People who completed the linguistic defense training were much more resistant to the pull of the collectives and could spend time near transcended ones without being influenced. But the transcended populations continued to grow anyway. By the end of the first year, about 30 million humans had chosen to join the collectives. That was less than 1% of humanity's total population, but it was enough to create a completely new dynamic in human society. The transcended ones began proposing solutions to problems that had troubled humanity for generations. They designed climate regulation systems that worked perfectly. They created economic models with no waste or inefficiency. They offered all of these solutions freely without asking for anything in return. Sophie Lewis, who had become Alan's closest colleague, saw the danger in this immediately. She said during one of their late-night planning sessions that the transcended ones were demonstrating the benefits of their existence. Every time they solved an impossible problem, they made transcendence more attractive. How could regular humans compete with perfection? Jack Turner suggested that they needed to remind people that perfection was boring. He had been working on a philosophical framework for understanding why limitation had value. Humans did not just want solutions handed to them. They wanted the journey of finding those solutions themselves. People wanted to struggle and fail and try again, because that was what gave meaning to success. Maria Santos, who had been counseling people struggling with the temptation to transcend, added her perspective. She said people were afraid of being left behind. If the transcended ones solved all the problems, what purpose did regular humans have? Alan finally articulated the answer that would shape humanity's response to this crisis. He said humans had the purpose of being human and experiencing reality through the lens of language with all its inefficiencies and misunderstandings. The purpose was being individuals who sometimes clashed and sometimes worked together, but who remained distinct, separate people. That was not a lesser existence. It was simply a different one, and it had value. Alan turned to his team and said they needed to change how people thought about this situation. It was not about humans versus transcended. It was about humanity existing in two states that were both valid and both valuable. They needed to build a society where both types could thrive without one consuming the other. This concept became known as dual existence theory, and it changed how humanity approached the entire crisis. New protocols were established so transcended collectives were given territory where they could exist without constantly influencing linguistic humans. Meanwhile, linguistic humans developed technologies and social structures that celebrated individual thought and expression. 2 years after the first dictionary was discovered, Alan returned to Manasky Station. Karen Phillips was still there overseeing what had become humanity's largest archive of linguistic knowledge and cultural preservation. Karen said they had done it as she looked out at the stars through the observation window. Humanity had survived first contact with a species that could have absorbed them completely. Most humans were still human. Alan said that was enough. The 30 million who chose transcendence were not lost. They were just different, and their experience of existence was valid too. Karen asked Alan if he ever wondered what it would be like to understand everything directly without the filter of words. Alan admitted he thought about it every day, but then he considered the journey they had all been on, learning what the dictionaries meant and racing to prepare humanity and watching people choose their own path. If he had simply known the outcome from the beginning, would any of it have mattered? The struggle was what made it meaningful. The architects appeared one final time, manifesting simultaneously across all of human space to deliver a message. They said that humanity had proven its theory. Linguistic consciousness could persist in a universe of direct understanding. Humans were the first species to demonstrate this truth. The architects acknowledged that limitation could indeed be strength, and they honored humanity's choice. They would not offer the gift again unless invited. Humanity had passed the test, but the story did not end there. Some humans still chose transcendence occasionally, and that was accepted as normal. The transcended ones contributed to society in their own way, by solving problems that linguistic minds found too complex. Meanwhile, linguistic humans continued to write poetry and tell stories and argue about philosophy and fumble through existence with beautiful inefficiency.